So the topic is that I've been asked to speak on relates to corporate political activities in emerging markets and some implications. It has wide implications, not just in accounting and finance, wide implications for a range of activities, corporate activities. Now, what I really want to do is to first of all ask the question, how do you achieve economic growth and economic development? People tend to use the word economic growth and economic development interchangeably, but in my mind there's a difference. You could have economic growth without economic development. Economic development covers a whole spectrum of activities like good health care, high quality education, good roads, low levels of pollution. That would be my measure of economic development. And economic growth, well, you have US is claiming that in the last year it achieved 3.9%, which is quite good in these times. So, but whether you like it or not, there is some relationship between economic growth and economic development. So the question is, how do you achieve economic growth and economic development? We are looking at these issues because there's one fundamental problem. That is what we want to try and achieve for each individual country, the global economy if possible. So what I'd like to do today is to show that corporate political activities can derail economic development and economic growth. It can derail. And I'm going to be drawing on a theory and a recent book by Francis Fukuyama, who introduces the idea of the state. And is the idea of the rule of law and the process of political decay. This is a very serious problem in my mind. That's hence my interest in this area. So just to present to you an outline of today's talk, I'm going to start with talking about what are the main engines of growth. I'm sure you've come across this, but there is some seminal work which has been cited very highly cited, widely cited, which does identify two factors that are critical for economic growth in any modern capitalist and pseudo-capitalist society. I use the word pseudo-capitalist cautiously, referring in particular to the Chinese capital market and Chinese economy. Now, and then I want to briefly talk about legal origin and politics because they go hand in hand. So the legislators, the lawmakers, if they do get involved in politics, there is a likelihood that politics could influence the decisions that they make as lawmakers. They are interrelated. I just talked briefly about that. Then I want to introduce you to a very interesting piece of work done recently, about 2 years ago. It's a book by Francis Fukuyama. Many of you might have heard of him. He talks about the state. And then I will finish off by talking about some corporate political activities, particularly as it relates to Indonesia and Malaysia, since these are the two countries that we are focusing on. Particularly, I want to focus on three types of corporate political activities. The word corporate political activity is very wide, but do remember there are three types of corporate political activity. The first one is what we call political connections, where members of the board, where the CEO might have direct connections with political parties or political interests or governments. The whole area of political economy, in fact, started off in terms of the fact that government, the state, gets involved in the business sector, and that's where the ideas of political economy evolved about 300 years ago, 200 years ago with the French physiocrats. We won't worry about them now. The second area is corporate contributions. How firms contribute to political parties. What sort of an impact is it likely to have? The amount of research that's done in this area and the understanding is actually very limited because it is treated like a black box and people don't want to go into it, largely because of the difficulty of obtaining reliable data. The third area I'll talk about is corporate lobbying. Again, we don't have much information in Indonesia and in Malaysia or this part of the world. This is more the kind of information that is available in the US and in Britain and in Australia, so some studies can be done in that area. So all in, this is a gray area, and it's crying out for some better understanding so that regulators and the government can think more about how to monitor and manage corporate political activities. Because I come back to the underlying theme of my talk, which is that these corporate political activities can undermine economic growth. So let me demonstrate to you how and what are the linkages. All right, I'll start with a seminal paper. Don't worry about that because I put this together. So that's the article. It's called A Stock Market, Banks and Economic Growth. It's published in the American Economic Review. The American Economic Review is the most prestigious economic journal in the US and in the world, very highly cited journal. And basically, the paper's objective is to try and understand what are the primary factors that drive economic growth. That's why it's interesting. Now, Levin and Zavos suggest two engines of economics growth, and they collected data from 23 countries. It's a very well-done study. And they come up with two systems. They want to find out whether these two engines, they look at many engines, they look at many factors, but they finally crystallize and come up with these two factors. One is the financial system. Your financial system has to be good. Your banks, your insurance, your other financial institutions lending houses and mortgage companies. So financial system. The financial system, they argue, spurs innovation and growth by identifying and funding productive investments. And this is really related to some of the work by Schumpeter. For those of you who are in economics would have heard of Schumpeter. The second engine of growth is the stock market, which is part of the capital market. And again, there has been much study to show that successful stock markets seem to be highly correlated with economic growth. So if you look around, a good example is China. When they opened up the economy and they developed the stock market, and as the stock market developed and boomed, the economic growth and to some extent economic development, you could see a clear change in their development process. So there is a correlation. I'm not saying one affects the other. I wouldn't take that sort of a position simply because I'm a scientist, and I'm just saying there is an association, but you can infer from that there is a relationship. Now, then we come to another very critical idea in economics, which is the role of capital markets as efficient resource allocation, as a mechanism for efficient resource allocation. This is critical because unless resources that are rare, resources that are scarce, are directed towards productive investments, these resources are going to be wasted. So to understand this, we look at the factors. So they look at market development indicators. What are they? The rate of capitalization, which measures the size of the stock market, values of listed domestic shares on domestic exchanges. The second group of measures they look at are market liquidity indicators, quite simple measures, turnover, which is liquidity, and the value traded. So using this as the dependent variable, as measures, or as independent measures, the so-called has dependent measures. They try to see whether the two factors they identify play a significant role in both these indicators. Now, there's also bank credit. If you're looking at banking development, they also look at bank credit. Bank credit improves upon traditional financial debt measures of banking development by isolating credit issued by banks to the private sector. They also look at loans made by commercial banks. Okay, so don't worry about this. These are the analysis, summarized analysis. What it shows here is that bank credit and turnover are very significant factors in affecting those indicators. So what do we have? We have summarized those results, and the results show that Levin and Zavos show that the stock market liquidity and banking, so you come back to the functions of the stock market, capital market has allocators of scarce resources, and you come back to the financial sector, also facilitating the allocation of scarce resources. Both of these affect economic growth. Okay, now we have established this from this particular study, which is a very highly studied, and it's established more or less by the World Bank that these are the two important drivers of economic growth and economic development. Now, so the question then is, what is it that facilitates the proper functioning of the stock market? What is it that facilitates the proper functioning, the efficient functioning of the financial sector, of the credit and financial institutions? And to do that, we look at shareholders, because they are the ones that you need to encourage. You need to encourage the shareholders to invest. And shareholders will only invest if they have confidence in the stock market. They know that they will be able to receive dividends. Similarly, creditors, individuals who are in the lending business, will only lend and be willing to participate extensively if they know that their resources, that the loans they give out can be retrieved, they can get back their loans that they have given, and also be able to collect interest on these loans. So for successful economic growth, you need to encourage and protect shareholders, investors, and creditors. So that's the link, right? So two institutions, two factors that are important: the stock market for development and financial institutions. These need to come together to facilitate the efficient allocation of resources. And how do you achieve that? You have to ensure that shareholders are happy, willing to invest, and the financial system is being facilitated because you have a system where they can retrieve or they can get back their resources that they have lent out. Okay, once we have established that linkage, we can then move to the second stage. How do you improve investors' and creditors' protection rights? That's basically what it is. Investors need to be protected, and creditors need to be protected. We come back to the rule of law. We come back to law, what we call legal protection. The legal protection, there's a vast literature that's looked at the difference between civil law, common law, Scandinavian law. There's a variety of laws that are available. Indonesia is interesting. You have civil law. You have a civil law system, which is different. I will quickly talk about that. Malaysia, for example, is common law. Britain, for example, is also, Australia is also common law. So you also have politics. Politics, the decisions made by regulators, government officials, politicians, does that affect the stock market? Does it affect investor protection? Does politics in business, in the corporate sector, does it affect the creditors? So there is a bit of a controversy right now in the literature. Is it laws? Is it alone important by itself? What about political activities? Is that also important? Or do these two interact to affect the quality of investor protection and the quality of creditor protection? Remember, both creditor protection, investor protection are twin objectives, because unless these two are protected, the likelihood of having an efficient and productive capital market will be derailed. Okay, legal origins, I'll just go through this very quickly. The two legal origins are common law and civil law. Common law is emphasizes more dispute resolving. Civil law seeks to replace such outcomes with state-desired allocation. The state is very much actively involved in a civil law system, so it's policy implementation. Common law is unconditional private contracting. Civil law, socially conditioned private contracting. There is some element of state involvement. Now, so the current rules and regulations that are available in Indonesia, in Malaysia, weren't thought of and weren't developed by local Indonesians, but they are due to historical origin of the country's laws. In the case of Malaysia, it's Britain, and in the case of Indonesia, it's largely Dutch. So, having said that, these writers, the empirical evidence, these writers on the role of legal protection of investors and creditors, they have measured and coded the laws of nations for 49 countries. They have done it. It's available. If you go to World Bank literature, you'll find quite a lot of it. And they find the conclusion is that common law countries are more protective than the laws of civil law countries. In other words, the common law does protect investors more, so the likelihood of having a more efficient stock market, more efficient credit system will be more likely with the common law system. So the conclusion is that legal investor protection is a strong predictor of financial development. Now, this is taken in isolation, but remember that in any country like Indonesia, if the laws, civil laws, are not very conducive towards investor protection, there are other ways that you can supplement these laws to ensure higher investor protection. So, just summarize there, you will find that in civil law countries, they find, not me, the literature suggests that they have a greater adverse impact on the markets, greater corruption, larger unofficial economy, higher unemployment, and in contrast, they find that common law countries, there is greater judicial independence, better contract enforcement, and greater security of property rights. Okay, now we move on to look at the second dimension, which is supposed to be, can affect investor protection, can also in fact affect creditor rights, and that comes from political economy theory. Political economy theory has been around for a very long time. So just to give you an idea, you've got several areas that they look at. They look at party systems, they look at the firm level political connections, political institutions, political orientations, government and other, electoral systems, political ideology. Political ideology is quite interesting. Left-wing and right-wing governments, they have different outcomes. There is a study that was done published in the European Journal of Political Economy, which showed that in the medical field, for example, how successful was the government in implementing drugs to control AIDS, and they find that in left-wing countries, they were more successful than in right-wing countries, that governments that are run by left-wing or right-wing governments. So these are quite simple, but they do affect the way the regulations are implemented, enforced, new regulations. In the US, of course, we have a good example, the Democrats and the Republicans. They have their own ideologies. If you are, the theory, I'll be talking about that in a while, that Republicans, they say, surprisingly, are more conservative. Democrats take more risk, and they find that these political ideologies permeate firms and affect their behavior. So there's a lot of interesting ideas that come from political economy. So, having said that, we identify laws, we identify the political system, corporate political activities, and say that these two could interact and affect investor protection so that you have a better stock market, you have a more confident stock market, which can facilitate growth. And then you remember the other dimension that's critical is your financial system. So we are arguing here that it's legal law and corporate political activity that in combination could affect the efficiency of the capital market as well as the financial system. So here we are now moving on in this talk to look at corporate political activity and look at it in more detail, okay? The questions are, should firms be allowed to employ politicians and or their family members? So I'm going directly to the issues in Indonesia and in Malaysia because that's what's happening. Politicians are involved in the corporate sector. Should firms be allowed to contribute funds to politicians and political parties? And if they are, should this be disclosed? Should firms be allowed to lobby politicians? So corporate political activity in this talk is just confined to these three areas. Political connections, which is membership of boards and politicians owning shares in the private sector in big companies, in particular listed companies. And the second one is contributions, political contributions. And thirdly, we are looking at corporate lobbying. So the question now is, let's look at the empirical evidence, the scientific evidence. What is the overall impact of CPA on the economy? Now to do that is not easy. You need some kind of a framework. So I am drawing on the work of Francis Fukuyama, who published a book recently. It's on the next slide. And his book is called Political Order and Political Decay from the Industrial Revolution to the Globalization of Democracy. And I'm going to summarize about 4 or 5 of the chapters and make it very simple. Basically, he argues that every country should be working towards being like Denmark. Not the real Denmark, but like Denmark. Because Denmark actually is almost approximating the ideal state. And it's not just Denmark, but it's also Norway and Sweden. These Scandinavian countries seem to have worked around this problem quite well in terms of work towards an ideal state. So he talks about Denmark, okay? And there are 3 institutions that Francis Fukuyama identifies. He says that these 3 institutions are critical for what he calls the modern state. The modern state. And these are so-called the non-patrimonial state, non-patrimonial, the rule of law, and democratic accountability. Now, let me just get into this a little bit more. Now, the state, what constitutes the state? He, first of all, talks in his book about the antecedents of the state. The idea that humans are social animals starts with mankind's primate ancestors because political order is rooted in human biology. So this is a point that he makes. I thought it was worth putting that up. Mankind that emerged from Africa 100,000 years ago, so this is what the scientists are saying, was socially organized, yet just like their primate forebears. Now, natural human sociability is based on the selection and reciprocal altruism. Now, this is important because this is what the culture is about. Altruism, but reciprocal altruism. Kin selection is part of our biological DNA, according to Fukuyama. Humans behave favorably to relatives, and so you have the idea of nepotism. And there's reciprocal altruism, exchange of favors, interests, between unrelated individuals. So historically, man developed starting as band-level societies of hunter-gatherers, and then they moved forward, and about 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, until about maybe 100 years ago, you have what is called patrimonial states. And the polity is the personal property of the ruler. A good example is Louis XIV. And you find many leaders, even democratically elected leaders, behaving like they are like patrimonial states, because these leaders feel they have a right to appoint their friends, their relatives. In fact, I'll go into some examples, specific examples. And so what Fukuyama is suggesting is that we need to move away from patrimonial states, that in fact it is the patrimonial states and that are causing many of the problems which he describes as political decay. Just the existence of these patrimonial states does not facilitate efficiency, both investor protection, because if you are not connected to these leaders or to their connections, then you are going to be at a disadvantage. So he comes up with the ideal state, the modern state, and one of the characteristics of the modern state is that the client's relationship to the ruler is based on status as an individual. All right? Positions in the administration are based on merit, education, and technology, and technical and knowledge. Now, this is important because I remember the background of this talk is Indonesia and Malaysia, because a lot of these patrimonial activities is occurring amongst the leaders. If you look at Malaysia, for example, until recently, the ruling group, which was the Barisan Nasional, which was under Najib, and the earlier UMNO group, you would only be able to obtain senior positions in government if you are linked to the leaders. You're linked to UMNO or you're linked to Barisan Nasional. And for many years, even in Indonesia, this has been going on. A good example was during the time of Suharto. And even, I suspect, current leaders do have this mentality of employing individuals who are either related or connected. So the first pillar in the Francis Fukuyama framework is the modern state. And the modern state characterized as non-patrimonial leadership, and everything is based on merit. It's quite interesting. 2005, 3,000 years ago, there was the Emperor Shi Huangdi in China, and they had a system of meritocracy. So individuals who wanted to join the civil service had to sit for a very rigorous exam, and it was entirely based on meritocracy, that individuals are appointed to the government. And even the appointment of generals, for example, was based on meritocracy, because the emperor didn't want to take a chance and appoint his nephew or his uncle as a general and lose the war. So he was smart enough to get the best person to to be a general in the army. So, and even till today, even in the communist system in China, They still have this system of meritocracy, that you sit for a common exam and only the best are selected into the civil service. All right. The second pillar that Fukuyama talks about is the rule of law. Rule of law. Rules are binding on the most powerful persons in society, and and in China this has been there in the Qin dynasty. So rule of law is very critical, and you find again, I'll be talking about US and Malaysia and Indonesia, that sometimes the rule of law is not followed. Some individuals can commit crime and can get away with it, while others who probably don't commit a crime end up in jail. The third element, third institution is democratic accountability. Accountability is critical, and the Parliament of John Locke, he was a political scientist in the 18th century, I think, obedience to rules should rest on the consent of the government. So, in other words, democratic accountability. And if you are not happy with the government, like what happened in Malaysia recently, you throw out the government and you have another government. So, what is important is that these three elements must coexist for the modern state. Now, the point that Fukuyama makes is that political leaders that adopt the outward forms of the modern state in reality rule for private gains, so the non-patrimonial leadership. And so you see this in several examples: Nigeria, South Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, China, and you see this in the form of what they call crony capitalism. That's the linkages between politicians, government servants, and business contacts. And this, he says, before I go to the last point, here's a graph that shows the idea of crony capitalism. It's very low in developing countries, but unfortunately, it's high in developing countries. So developed countries, it's low. In developing countries, it's high. And here's a measure. I'm sorry if you can't see it from the back there. It's a scale, crony capitalism index. The worst, of course, is Russia, surprise, followed by Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Ukraine. Indonesia is number 7, so that's not very good. So both Malaysia and Indonesia, which is the focus of discussion, has a very high level of crony capitalism. These are very reliable indicators, and they are available on the internet. Okay, that's Malaysia, and that's Indonesia. So, understanding the links between the state, politicians, and the corporate sector, how are rules of the game set and enforced for firms by governments? How does the government treat these corporations? So this is a backdrop of trying to understand the consequences of failing in one of these institutions in the Fukuyama framework. And we'll now talk about corporate political activity. And the thesis that I'm putting forward is that corporate political activities, in fact, are signs of political decay, which means that they can derail, that indirectly they can derail attempts at improving the efficiency of the stock market, improving the functionings of the financial system, and any one of these that are adversely affected will affect economic growth based on the Levine and Zavos model. Okay, so we see this government munificence and distortionary subsidies. Governments purchases from linked companies paying prices well above cost. There are hundreds of examples in Malaysia and Indonesia, not lately, but previously. One linked company bailing out another linked company, also I see this in Malaysia. Firms protected linked firms from foreign competition, the government steps in with regulation and tariffs to protect inefficient and old, tired industries that are linked to politicians or government officials, and corporate political activity in both developed and emerging countries. So this is not a particular problem with emerging companies, it's also with developed countries. In fact, Fukuyama makes the point that in the US, there are signs of political decay. 2 or 3 years ago, the whole of the US system, the budget was not approved and they had to nearly close down. The structure of the US system, he argues, is in political decay. Of course, with the introduction of the policies that Trump has introduced, there is clear evidence of what Fukuyama calls political decay. All right, so we will talk a little bit about rent-seeking and give some examples, just very briefly. This is the Malaysian latest scandal, the 1MDB. I think you've heard lots about it in your own press, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, how state-owned funds were channeled to private gains, and there was rampant rent-seeking activities. And this particular article is frightening because it implicates so many individuals. Some individuals have even disappeared, and the AG, number 2 AG there, the photograph at the bottom there, he was a deputy public prosecutor who was allegedly bringing a case against the Prime Minister. The first prosecutor was relieved of his job by the Prime Minister the moment there were signs that he was going to bring a case against the Prime Minister. Then the second man disappeared, and he was found in a encasement made of cement. So he was murdered, and the other guy also disappeared. So, and there are some individuals who are involved, but this is quite interesting. There's a book that's out that's been written about the Malaysian, the scandal, the 1MDB scandal. So if you're interested, you should just read more about it. So you're looking at amounts like $42 billion and amounts that have appeared in the Prime Minister's account, the previous Prime Minister's account. Questions are raised. How did this money appear in the Prime Minister's account? Where did it come from? Where did it go? And so here was all the senior officials that were appointed, including the police, including the corruption agency, were all linked to the Prime Minister. So you had what is called a patrimonial state with the key regulators and key individuals, officers linked to the political system. So lots of money have been lost, and that's a very good example of the patrimonial state. Let's come to Indonesia. There is a paper by Fukuoka, published in 2012. It talks about political transition. Reformation or reformasi did not facilitate the emergence of a regulatory state, what he calls a modern state, what Fukuyama calls a modern state, but merely a transformation of patrimonial states. So they say that it started, the Reformation was actually a patrimonial state. And the transition shifts the country from a patrimonial administrative state, what they call a politico-bureaucratic elites based in the state, which enjoy upper hand against business elites, to what he says today in Indonesia is a patrimonial oligarchic in the sense that the business leaders are beginning to control your economy, beginning to control your state, rather than the people who are elected. This is similar to the situation to Russia, where the oligarchy actually runs the show. Now, Francis Fukuyama identifies this as political decay. He says you're asking for trouble, because what will happen is with political decay, you will then have difficulty in running your country, and that could then derail your economic development and your economic growth. So the system, according to this guy Fukuoka, is that you have what is called a patrimonial oligarchic state. So business has an economic base independent of the state apparatus, and they are involved in the administration of the state. So what this guy says is that patrimonial oligarchy state, this is the term that's used to describe Indonesia. And information has empowered the parliament, which is your DPR, and power no longer resides in particular individuals as per during the Suharto's regime. I'll just talk about that in a while. There is an increase in the number of entrepreneurs turned politicians in parliament. This is particularly so in Indonesia rather than in Malaysia, which is also similar but not as popular. So there are examples there. I think these are names that you guys are familiar with. Halim Kala, Yusuf Kala's younger brother, and their family businesses were occasionally given priority by the government. And there's a quote there, "It is like queuing up to watch a film at the cinema, while others have to join a long queue. We can go directly to second or third place." This was taken from an article by Tempo. The editor is sitting there actually. Thank you for that. Very interesting. I actually read that quite often and get very good ideas on the Indonesian scene. All right, now we have some interesting signs of political decay. Here's our good friend Donald Trump, who said that he thought that the election was a victory, even though they lost the House. So he's probably just talking about the Senate. But that's a big change, and that's important. I think that the House has gone back to Democrats, so you will see more balance and more monitoring. It's also interesting that the number of females in the House has increased. In fact, the little bit of news that I picked up was that there are 2 Muslim ladies, one from Palestine and one from Somalia, who have been elected to the House. And the first time that a native Indian, Red Indian, has been selected to, has won an election to the House. Now, these other characters here, I think you know these guys. Satya, I just got to get a bit closer. Novanto and Harry Tano. Now, these 3 guys have been linked to President Trump. Again, from Tempo and other magazines, information, we see that this guy is a former speaker, former chairman of the Golkar party. Satya, he was convicted guilty for corruption, and he's linked to a number of corruption investigations. US $400 million is a lot of money. Okay. There's another picture here that was this picture was taken in September 2015 at the presidential primary campaign at Trump Tower in New York. The meeting was held with the direct assistance of Mr. Trump's new Indonesian partner, Harry Tano. Mr. Trump and Mr. Tano are business partners, and they're looking at a mega resort and an associated theme park, SkyTrain, and Formula One racing track in a 3,000-hectare site in Bogor. Constructed, there's also construction of a road toll, and clearly there's going to be a lot of money coming in. They have already tripled their value of the resort land as the result of the completion of toll road. Now, clearly, I do support incentives, financial incentives, but this is outrageous and clearly a sign of political decay as far as I'm concerned within the Fukuyama framework. So this is a marriage between politicians and business people. The head of Human Rights Watch Indonesia said that he thought the meeting between the Indonesian politician and Mr. Trump was unethical. So there are individuals who are raising questions, and the law is taking its course with that particular individual. So that's a good sign, because it means that the rule of law is kicking in, and that's to be encouraged. This is further about the MNC Group, and they are planning to build a huge complex hotel villas, condominium in a redevelopment area in, I think it's in East Java or in Bali, I'm not sure. Would you know? Bali, okay. All right, here's a photograph of the family. Mr. Trump, Mr. Tano, he's Trump, with Mr. Trump, Donald, and they talk about the role of each of the family members of Trump will have a different role in the project. Donald Jr. is responsible for the overall project. Eric is more on the design and the golf, and Ivanka is more on the details like the fit out of the hotels. Now, what other term would you use for this except a patrimonial, highly patrimonial state? So Francis Fukuyama warns, you are in for trouble because that is clear evidence of political decay. So things are not from this angle, and I believe things are not what they should be. Okay, we make assertions, and in my field of accounting, finance, and economics, my training is in economics, so we make assertions, we need to collect empirical evidence. And after collecting the empirical evidence, you need to analyze the data, and this has to be very rigorous. So increase the reliability and validity. I see a lot of papers, as an editor, I see a lot of papers. They use regression, they use some statistics, but they are inappropriate to draw any conclusion. So we are very cautious in the way we handle scientific evidence. To show, the question now is, we've been making these allegations, but what about the body of research? Does it show that corporate political activities affect firm-level outcomes? And this is interesting because the theory, well, this was the corporate political activities they're talking about. But let me just put this up here. Now, the theory is that corporate political activities are not necessarily bad. There are actually two schools of thought. One is that there are benefits because you have systematic exchange of favors, and it benefits, that firms can benefit from government support and have softer budget constraints by being politically connected with the government. So the corporate sector can actually be facilitated if you have corporate political activities. On the other side, there are potential costs because of rent-seeking activities by the businesses and politicians, siphoning off funds. It's less transparent, and they conceal expropriation activities, and there's poor quality. The directors who are appointed on the basis of patrimonial connections are poorer quality because of their political connections. So the theory, in political economy theory, some people argue that corporate political activities are good, and some say, well, it could be disadvantageous to the economy and the firm. Now let's start with one paper which was published by Mara Fascio, and it was again in the American Economic Review, and they looked at two questions. What common characteristics do countries with widespread political connections have? They just wanted to see what are the common characteristics. Do connections add to company value? Now, connections could add to company value at firm level, but the question is, does it add to the economy? That is a more difficult question. And what they found was that political connections can be connected with members of parliament, connected with ministers or head of states, and companies closely related to a top official. So they define this as political connections. And then they have examples. Connections with government ministers include cases in which politician is a large shareholder or a top director, as well as cases where the politician has a close relative, son or daughter, which holds such positions. And during the time of Mahathir, about 20 years ago, his children were involved in business, and there was some close relationship. So there are two there. Example is Consortium Logistik Berhad. This was in Malaysia. And then there is the second example, which is taken from Europe. Its connections with members of parliament. Fiat, for example, in France, there is, can't see from here, it would be even worse for you, I'm sorry. Taittinger, Rolls-Royce in UK, Enron in US, all these were related to members of parliament. So there are some figures here. I wouldn't worry too much about it. So they found that political connections were widespread in 35 out of 47 companies, mainly in countries which are perceived as highly corrupt, mainly in countries which imposes restrictions on foreign investments for obvious reasons. And they did a study to see whether these politically connected firms, did they have better stock prices? This was a very simple measure. Did they have better stock prices? And in the moment you look at stock prices, you're looking at investor perception. Because investors perceive positively, they are willing to pay more. So we don't know. So it's an empirical question. And they found that when there was an announcement that a politician was being appointed to the board, for example, the share prices of those companies went up. So they argue that it increases corporate values. And these are the results. Now, this is another paper that looks at the politically connected firms and the cost of equity. Now, again, cost of equity is important if you want to be able to raise funds. If you are having difficulty raising funds, then again you would have a problem in meeting the objectives of economic development that I talked about, the structure and that I talked about, framework that I talked about. So here they were looking at, this is a very strong journal, Journal of Corporate Finance, and they used 26 countries. It's quite dated, 2011, and they look at Canada, Germany, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and the political connections were as defined earlier by Fascio, and they measured the cost of equity in terms of the implied cost of equity, its ex ante expected returns, implied by current market value and future cash flows of the firms. This is easily computed. Results, they show that politically connected firms enjoy a lower cost of equity. Political connections are more valuable for firms with stronger political ties. The relationship is stronger for countries with less press freedom, less democracy, higher corruption, and limited market development. So political connections exist. Political connections are very strongly correlated with the cost of capital. Okay, then you have, this is a very early article about Suharto and the stock market. Now this is interesting because I'll just summarize this paper for you. Suharto was connected to several companies, or his family was connected to several companies. And this paper actually looks at what happens when there was an announcement about his health. So he had several health episodes. I think those of you from here know. He had heart problems. And so they looked at all these different episodes, and they measured connections to Suharto on a scale of 1 to 5. So a scale of 5, very high connections, is when Suharto's own children were involved in the company. Then there were long-time allies of Suharto, Bob Hassan, Liam Xiao, and so on. And scores of 1 were indirectly connected to Suharto, firms owned by close friends. Okay? So, and they did this study. You probably can't see that, but let me explain what the results say. The results say that when each episode of his health was announced in the Indonesian newspaper that there was a problem, the stock prices of firms linked to Suharto dropped. It dropped more severely for firms that were more closely related to Suharto than less closely related to Suharto. And that's the diagram there, which is in the paper, and I'm just summarizing it for you. So what does it show? It shows that the stock market is aware of these connections, and the moment there is signs that his health is failing, the stock prices drop. Investors perceive a drop in the value of the company. Okay, since I'm running out of time, I just wanted you to know that there are many papers that have been published by Indonesian academics, including our Pak Iman here from Airlangga University, who looked at military connections. He identified firms that had military connections. Now, in Indonesia, military apparently or allegedly have links with the government. And having those connections does facilitate businesses. And that was the paper done. I urge you to look at the references and pull out this paper and read it if you'd like to have a better understanding. So there are these several of these papers. This was another paper that looked at political connections, related party transactions, and auditor choice. That firms that are politically connected, the way they have defined it in one of those three ways, were actually less likely to appoint a Big Four auditor. The reason being Big Four auditors were more likely to provide better monitoring and more stringent financial reporting. So because of that, these companies avoided the Big Four firms. And they also talk about related party transactions. This is the paper by Iman Harimawan. Why do firms appoint military personnel as directors? Evidence of low interest rate in military-connected firms. And he finds that firms that are connected with the military actually get lower interest rates. So you go to the bank will charge you an interest rate depending on your risk. So if you're a high-risk borrower, then your interest rate is likely to be higher. But they find that the large number of firms, they find that military-connected firms have got lower interest rate. So there's some kind of a preferential treatment. So there are large number of studies, and this one was on Malaysia, Crony Capitalism. This was during the Asian financial crisis when Mahathir introduced capital controls. Why did you think he introduced capital controls? He was protecting politically connected firms, because the value of the shares of these politically connected firms dropped drastically during the Asian financial crisis. He needed to find some mechanism to prop these companies up, and he introduced capital controls. And so this paper shows that the companies that were closely linked to UMNO politicians, when the capital controls were introduced, they actually did not suffer. So this is just a diagram of stock returns. You can see that during the crisis period, politically connected firms experienced a 60%, 40 to 60% depletion in the stock exchange value, the share prices. The moment capital controls were introduced, these firms went up. For non-politically connected firms, they were not affected by the crisis, and they did not get any preference in terms of the capital controls. And so maybe I'll just talk about this. This is a paper that I wrote. I wanted to see so-called auditors. The auditors are supposed to have professional ethics. They are supposed to follow some regulations as well as some professional standards. And the expectation is that auditors would be very difficult to fool, because it's their job to disclose the likelihood of material misstatements. Again, material misstatements are very expensive. If you don't discover a misstatement or a financial statement that is not true or not correct, escapes and gets, it relates to the efficient allocation of capital resources again, because the stock market doesn't know the creditors provide, the auditors provide credibility to the financial statements. So in this paper, what I did was I looked at Malaysia, and I found that actually the auditors were aware of political connections, and when there was rent-seeking and corruption, the auditors did rise to the occasion and charge higher fees. So we infer that if you are charging higher fees, controlling for a lot of factors like your size, your accounts receivable, and so on, these are standard models, that the auditors perceive these companies as being associated with higher risk and hence higher audit fees. Okay, so these slides are available, and please look at them. I'll just quickly go and talk about Stiglitz on lobbying. Stiglitz, of course, he argues that, that lobbying is a waste of tax dollars on unnecessary and inefficient projects, because you lobby to get your project through, and it's redistributing money from one part of society to the other. He says it's a centripetal force that hollows out the economy because the rewards of rent-seeking become so outsized that more and more energy is directed towards it at the expense of everything else. Actually, in a nutshell, he says lobbying is a form of corruption. And lobbying is very widespread in many of these countries, particularly in the US. And here they show that in the US, they show that actually firms that lobby, their enforcement of the regulatory process is delayed. In other words, lobbying does affect the implementation of the regulations and the regulatory process. Okay, now I will stop with that, with the last slide there of the classical example of patrimonial state that's come back to haunt us, and that's our friend Donald Trump and his family. With that, thank you very much.